Okay, so welcome to ESS. We're going to look at an introduction to biodiversity today. And here are our questions to consider. We're going to define biodiversity, and it's three components. So there's actually kind of four definitions. So you'll need to know the overall definition of biodiversity, and then the definitions of both species, habitat, and genetic diversity, which are all encompassed in the overarching definition of biodiversity. We're going to look at why biodiversity is important, and we will then look at using biodiversity indices to calculate a biodiversity index. And then lastly, we will define biodiversity hotspot and look at some criteria used to identify them. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to take you into this PowerPoint, and here is the original kind of definition of biodiversity. So it's a broad concept encompassing the total diversity of living systems, which includes the diversity of species, species diversity, habitat diversity, and genetic diversity. So it's got all three of these kind of levels of biodiversity involved in it. You should know this definition and be able to use it, this plus the three individual definitions from here. This diagram that I have talks about habitat diversity and more like ecosystem diversity, but we're going to use the term habitat diversity today. Okay, so species diversity is generally what we think of when we're talking about biodiversity. So that is basically the number of species that you find in an area, but it's actually a product of two different variables. It's the number of species you find in an area, which is the richness, and the relative proportions, which is evenness. So it's like if we were looking here at this little ecosystem to count the species diversity, we would do the richness, like, oh, here is one type of plant, here's two species with a slug, here's three, here's four, here's five, here's six, and the tree is seven. So maybe the richness would be seven. And then the evenness would be how evenly those are distributed in numbers. It's kind of hard to tell from this diagram, but how big is the population of this versus this versus this versus this versus this? Because having a more even spread of the populations generally indicates a greater biodiversity than if you have almost all of like a large population of one species and just a handful of the other species that are there, because having smaller populations makes it more vulnerable. And we know that species diversity is important to maintain community structure and food webs. So if you have a very diverse species community, if one species goes extinct, that can usually make it so if it's really diverse, then there's probably other things for those species to eat, and it can help maintain those food webs. Okay, habitat diversity. Now that is the range of different habitats in an ecosystem. So this one's kind of, you can see this picture saying ecosystem diversity, but we're looking at there's, old trees and young trees, and there's stream banks, and there's a stream, and there's a grassy meadow. So there's a bunch of different types of habitats. Well, if you have a bunch of different types of habitats, that means there's a lot more niches available. So it can actually increase species diversity, because if you have organisms that can live in this field versus other organisms that might live on this tree, so, and maybe fish or whatever that may be. So the greater diversity of habitats that you have, generally, that can support a greater species biodiversity. And the last bit, genetic diversity, that's the range of genetic material present in the population of species. So we're looking at all the gene pools of all the species. And having a lot of genetic diversity is really important, because it actually makes them more resilient, because there's a lot more genetic material for natural selection to work with. So if there's, a certain gene in an individual that makes it so it's more vulnerable to dying from global warming or something like that, then if there's a greater diversity, maybe there's some individuals that might be able to survive that. So having a greater genetic diversity within a population makes that population more resilient to extinction. Okay, and in valuing biodiversity, the arguments generally range from, aesthetic, meaning we enjoy looking at it, it's beautiful, seeing something like this rich, lush rainforest. But it's also ecological, economic, ethical, the right to exist, right? And then there's also social justifications based on, what the needs of the culture, people that actually enjoy going out in nature? Is it part of your culture to go out and, say, hunt for mushrooms or other things like that? Economic arguments can range from things like having ecotourism, right? So you know that there's a lot of different places around coral reefs and rainforests, and even here in Czech Republic that that really thrive on people coming in and using nature as a resource, for economic resource, right? Because you can have restaurants around there, you can offer guide services. People could go on dives or whatever that may be. So there can be a lot of money that can be brought in an area, in a national park. You might charge or give tours. As a genetic resource, actually, and I would say even genetic or medical resource, having these different organisms that could possibly have potential commercial value for medicines or being able to use those genes to help cure certain diseases. And then, of course, there's the commercial consideration of the natural capital. If you have a healthy ecosystem, that probably means that there is more natural income that could be generated that you could then use to make actual money from by selling, whether it's the timber or other things. The ecological reasons, those ecosystem services, clean water, air, soil stability, so we don't suffer from erosion. Those are all super important. The ethical arguments can generally be broad. The intrinsic value of the right for species to exist. That goes along, the lines of which species should we consider to, have enough value to survive. Well, they might not have an economic value, but we might decide, they have the right to actually live and be on this planet. And I think that one thing that we can all agree on these days is just the social justification, the aesthetic and ethical, how important nature is to us, that we can still get out there and enjoy it. Okay. One very important thing you're going to need to be able to do is quantify species diversity. And we use these things called biodiversity indices to be able to put a value on biodiversity itself. And that can help with conservation efforts. So if we can actually kind of track what that biodiversity is, we can see if it's changing over time. So it can compare similar ecosystems, like how biodiverse is the forest in Czech Republic to the forest in Germany. We could look at the same ecosystem over time and seeing if there's anything that's impacting it, like human impact. So if there's been a lot of logging in the forest, we could measure the biodiversity before and after. And then when we're comparing biodiversity, we know that low biodiversity could be indicative of pollution or some other disturbance, eutrophication, or maybe recent colonization from some invasive species or something like that. Okay, so the way that we're going to quantify it is we are going to quantify it using the Simpsons Biodiversity Index. This is actually the reciprocal index. And so here's the equation. The Simpsons Biodiversity Index equals n times n minus 1 over the sum of n times n minus 1. And so this big N is the total population of all the organisms added together, and this little n is the individual different smaller populations. So I'm going to work through a practice problem where we're going to actually compare two different areas. So we have area A has these 4 different species in it, and area B also has these 4 different species in it. So actually their richness is the same. So they have 4 different species and 4 different species. The evenness is slightly different between these two. So you can see it looks like area A, the spread of how many species there are, or how big the populations are, is a lot more even here in area A than it is in area B, where there's a lot more skew in these middle 2 individuals. So if we were to compare area A to B, we would compare the richness, we would compare the evenness, and we would also then compare the biodiversity index. Excuse me. Okay. So I have a little video that's going to take you through a problem. I'll do area A for you, and then I'll have you do area B. So I haven't tried to do this when I'm screencasting, but let's give this a shot. Okay. So here is an example about how to do Simpsons Biodiversity Index. So Simpsons diversity index. This is the reciprocal. And here's our equation, and here is area A from our example that we were doing with the PowerPoint. So here's the 4 different species. So we know that the richness is 4. Richness is 4 because there's 4 different species. And evenness in this case is relatively subjective, but we'll compare that to area B richness in a little bit. So if we were to calculate the Simpsons diversity index, we're going to take the total number, that's n, of all the species added up. So this adds up to 20, so 4 plus 5 plus 7 plus 4. And then we're going to plug that in here. So it'll be 20 times 20 minus 1, which is essentially 19, right? And then down below, the little n stands for each of the individual populations. And so if we were to set up the below one, we would do 4 times 4 minus 1 is 3, plus, because that's the sum of 5 times 5 minus 1. 5 minus 1 is 4, okay? Plus 7 times 7 minus 1 is 6, plus 4 times 3. Okay? So if we were to do 20 times 19 essentially, right? So 20 times 19 is 380, right? And then 4 times 3 is 12, plus 20, plus 42, plus 12. So that equals 380 divided by 86, if I add all these together. And 380 divided by 86 is about 4.4. Okay? Okay, so now what I want you to try, you might want to hit pause, but I want you to try to add up area B and figure out what the diversity is there to compare the two. All right, and then once you hit play again, you can see we have the two differences. We've got area A is 4.4 and area B is 2.9. So if you didn't get 2.9, make sure you ask me to go over how to do it when we come back together at the end of the class. Okay, the last little bit we have is looking at biodiversity hotspots. And these are regions with a high level of biodiversity, but it has to that's under threat from human activity. And these are places like usually things like tropical rainforests, coral reefs, and to qualify, it has to meet 2 strict criteria. It has to contain at least 0.5% or 1,500 species of vascular plants as endemics. And endemic means that it's from that region only. So it's not that all those species are not all over the globe. And it has to have lost at least 70% of its primary vegetation. And so it's a hotspot because, first of all, it's super biodiverse. It contains a whole bunch of different species, but also it's under a lot of threat. It's lost a lot of its vegetation. You lose the vegetation, you're losing the primary productivity, which could result in more of a collapse. Okay, so that is 5.1. And if we were to take a look at our questions to consider here, the definitions of biodiversity you need to know in those 3 components. You need to be able to talk about biodiversity's importance. Why do we use biodiversity indices? Can you calculate biodiversity index? And in that, you need to be able to identify richness and kind of talk about evenness. And then what's a biodiversity hotspot and what do we use to identify them?